The cold came first. It was not the usual biting cold of high mountains or polar plains. It was a deep, gnawing emptiness that seemed to creep into every bone and muscle. Veilrix wrapped herself in the thin thermal cloak of her exile vessel, her fingers stiff and unresponsive as she struggled with the controls. Her ship had not been built for long-term survival, and the frozen world below made that painfully obvious. Each shiver reminded her that she was alone, far from her home, and facing a planet that had no mercy. She had always been confident, precise, brilliant. As one of the best engineers of her world, she had constructed energy conduits, survival modules, and even emergency warp drives. Yet none of that mattered now. The Empire had cast her out, claiming she had failed in her duty. The truth was far more complicated. She had refused to abandon a colony that depended on her. She had refused to leave others to die because the Empire saw them as expendable, and for that she was exiled. Her vessel shuddered violently as it broke through the atmosphere, ice crystals scratching the hull and leaving faint streaks like tears on metal. Veilrix tightened her grip on the controls. She had calculated 1,000 ways this landing could go wrong. The chances of surviving unscathed were slim. The chances of survival at all were even slimmer, yet she refused to panic. Panic was a luxury her species could not afford, and she had no intention of indulging it. Below her stretched a vast frozen plain, glittering under the pale light of a distant sun. The planet was uninhabited, or at least it seemed so. There were no cities, no colonies, no signs of intelligent life, just endless ice, jagged rocks, and the faint shimmer of frozen lakes. Veilrix's sensors detected no breathable atmosphere in some regions, only bitterly cold winds and barren terrain. Every instinct screamed at her to find shelter immediately. She adjusted her descent, trying to locate a ridge or a cave that could break the impact of the landing. The crash came suddenly, a violent jolt that threw her against the seat. Alarms blared, red lights flashing in rhythm with the pounding of her heart. Veilrix gritted her teeth and pulled the emergency thrusters. The ship skidded across the frozen plain, metal scraping ice, before finally tipping onto its side with a deafening crunch. Dust, or rather ice and metal shards, filled the air. Veilrix coughed, tears freezing on her cheeks. She was alive, but only barely. Every joint ached and her cloak had torn in the landing. She crawled from the wreckage, scanning for any signs of life or shelter. There was nothing but the endless white expanse and the unrelenting wind. She tucked herself into the remains of the ship as best as she could, trying to conserve body heat. It was then that she noticed it, a movement in the distance, small but unmistakable. A figure trudged across the ice, leaving a faint trail in the snow. Veilrix's eyes narrowed. Life. Another life on this dead world. Her mind raced through possibilities. Enemy, predator, rescue. Her species had always feared other intelligent beings on distant planets, often assuming they were hostile. But her sensors indicated something odd. This being's heat signature was low but steady. Not a predator, not a machine. Human, perhaps? She had read about humans in her archives, studied their physiology, and even mocked their fragility. They were said to be weak, vulnerable, and ill-equipped for survival in extreme climates. Yet the figure moved with determination, a slow but steady resilience that made her pause. By the time the human reached her ship, Veilrix had made a decision. She needed warmth, she needed survival, and if this creature, this human, was as resilient as it seemed, she might just have a chance. The human stopped a few meters away, eyes widening at the wreckage. He was young, dressed in a combination of insulated gear that looked patched together from various expeditions. His breath came out in visible clouds, but his posture was straight, confident. He observed the damaged ship with curiosity rather than fear. Veilrix stepped forward, her voice loud and sharp, cutting through the howling wind. "Shut up, human. It's freezing. Get in my bed now." "Your bed?" he asked cautiously, unsure if he had understood correctly. "Yes, now, do you want to die of frostbite or do you want to survive?" Her teeth chattered, but she did not lower her voice. There was no time for subtlety. Survival demanded direct action. The human hesitated. Then, with a shrug, he stepped forward. Perhaps he sensed the urgency. Perhaps he trusted the instinct behind her command. Veilrix watched him carefully as he entered the small, cramped space of her ship, the heat from his body immediately noticeable. She adjusted her cloak to allow them to share warmth, carefully avoiding unnecessary contact, but letting the heat flow between them. Minutes passed. Slowly, the immediate danger of hypothermia began to subside. Veilrix observed the human's physiology with fascination. His body retained heat far more efficiently than she had predicted. He shivered less, moved with surprising agility, and seemed capable of enduring conditions that would have killed one of her species within an hour. She frowned. Her understanding of human weakness had been incomplete. You are tougher than I expected," she admitted finally, her voice low. "Your species, you survive where no others can." Yet here was one, alive in conditions that had already killed part of her own spirit with doubt. The contradiction gnawed at her mind. As the night stretched on, Veilrix and the human Ethan, she learned his name, shared warmth, supplies, and knowledge. Ethan showed her how to create small fires in the remaining energy cores, how to ration limited thermal blankets, and how to use reflective panels to trap heat. Veilrix, in turn, taught him some of her engineering tricks, improving the efficiency of their makeshift shelter. For the first time since her exile, Veilrix felt a strange sense of respect. Not for the human himself, but for what he represented. A species that did not depend solely on technology to survive. A species that could face death with courage, ingenuity, and a strange stubbornness. Hours turned into an uncomfortable, cold dawn. Outside, the wind howled, but inside, a fragile warmth persisted. Veilrix sat back, exhausted but alert, watching Ethan move with precise, confident movements. She realized that the human was teaching her something her own culture had long forgotten. That survival was not always about the strongest weapon, the most advanced shield, or the highest technology. Sometimes it was about endurance, creativity, and the ability to work with what nature provided. You are not as weak as I thought," she muttered, almost to herself. "Perhaps my people were wrong." About strength, Veilrix watched the light reflect off the frost, and for a moment she allowed herself to imagine hope. Perhaps she would survive. Perhaps she would find a way to fight back, not with weapons, but with knowledge, courage, and the strange resilience she now saw in humans. Ethan broke the silence. "You know, for someone who just screamed at me to get into your bed, you're surprisingly calm now. Then I guess we'll make a good team." It would be because of him, a creature she had once dismissed, a creature the Empire would have deemed expendable, a creature whose biology and spirit defied every expectation. And for the first time since her exile, Veilrix allowed herself a thought she had long considered impossible. Perhaps humans were not weak at all. Perhaps in their strange, unassuming way, they were something stronger than her people had ever imagined. The wind outside continued to howl, the ice glittering like shards of glass, but inside the vessel, warmth remained. It was small, fragile, but enough. Enough to survive another day. Enough to survive, and perhaps, just perhaps, to change everything she thought she knew about life, strength, and hope. As Veilrix closed her eyes, still alert and calculating, she made a silent promise. She would not waste this chance. She would learn from this human, and she would survive. And when the Empire came for her, she would be ready. Not just with her technology, but with the resilience, courage, and adaptability that only humans seem to possess. The cold night stretched on, but within the tiny wrecked vessel, a flicker of warmth, a spark of understanding, and a seed of an alliance had been born. Veilrix had survived the first night of exile, not alone, but with the most unlikely of companions. A human who, by all measures, should have been weaker than her, but who had already proven to be stronger than she could have imagined. And for Veilrix, that was the most dangerous and most thrilling discovery of all. The first sunrise over the frozen plains revealed more than just light. It revealed the unforgiving scale of the world Veilrix had landed on. She stepped carefully over the ice shards outside the vessel, scanning the horizon for any sign of shelter beyond the wreckage. The human Ethan moved beside her, his boots crunching over the frost with steady precision. He seemed completely at ease despite the harsh environment. Veilrix studied him closely. Every movement he made seemed effortless, though the temperature was well below anything she had ever considered survivable. "You do this every day?" she asked, her voice a mix of curiosity and disbelief. Ethan shrugged, adjusting the straps of his makeshift backpack. "Survive? Pretty much. The cold is just another problem to solve." She had expected him to shiver uncontrollably, to complain, to falter. But he did not. His hands, though slightly red from the cold, moved with deliberate, careful actions. His eyes scanned the terrain constantly, calculating risk and opportunity in a way that made her realize she was witnessing a different kind of intelligence. A raw, instinctive intelligence that no sensors could measure. They reached the edge of a small ice canyon. The walls rose steep and smooth, and the wind whistled through the narrow opening, carrying the scent of ice and mineral. Ethan crouched, tapping on a small handheld device that emitted a faint blue light. There's a cave system below, not mapped, but I've found signs of airflow, could be warmer inside. Airflow, she asked skeptically, on a frozen planet. He carried no heavy exosuit, no thermal plating, just his own body, layered clothing, and his mind. The cave entrance loomed ahead. The wind whipped sharply, making the edges of the ice jagged and slippery. Veilrix stepped carefully, while Ethan moved as if he had walked here 1,000 times. Inside the cave, the temperature rose slightly. The walls reflected faint light, creating a quiet, serene glow. Veilrix could feel her body relaxing for the first time since the crash. She had expected relief to be mechanical, dependent on her technology. Instead, it came from a human's knowledge, instinct, and courage. As they settled inside, Ethan pulled out a small survival pack, distributing food and water. Veilrix watched as he tore open rations, carefully measuring each portion. Her people had grown up believing efficiency meant maximizing output and minimizing waste. Humans, it seemed, took efficiency to a different level. They valued sustainability, endurance, and balance with their surroundings. "You ration carefully," Veilrix remarked, observing him. Ethan nodded. "Every calorie counts when the body burns more than expected. You'd be surprised how much energy you can lose just walking in deep snow." She felt a pang of admiration, tinged with frustration. Her pride demanded that she dismiss him, but every fact, every observation kept challenging that instinct. They spent the next hours reinforcing the cave entrance. Veilrix taught Ethan how to use fragments from her ship to create small reflective surfaces, redirecting sunlight deeper into the cave. Ethan showed her how to channel airflow to conserve heat without overexerting their bodies. For the first time in her life, Veilrix realized that technology alone was not always enough. Sometimes, survival depended on understanding the natural world and working with it, not against it. Night fell quickly. The temperature plummeted, colder than anything Veilrix had imagined. She felt a familiar fear creeping into her mind, the fear of failure, of death, of isolation. But it did not take hold. Ethan moved beside her, checking their improvised insulation, offering tips in a calm, reassuring tone. Veilrix realized that his presence was more than comforting, it was stabilizing. His calmness, his focus, his unwavering confidence, it was contagious. "You humans really are tougher than I thought," she admitted quietly. "I expected you to freeze, to falter, to complain, but you endure." Her species believed in predictability, in planning for every eventuality through logic and technology. Humans, however, thrived in unpredictability. They faced danger, chaos, and unknown variables not with fear, but with curiosity, observation, and ingenuity. It was remarkable. Hours passed in quiet study and conversation. Veilrix found herself asking questions she had never considered before. How do humans maintain morale in extreme conditions? How do they stay calm under pressure? How do they make decisions with limited information? Ethan answered patiently, explaining routines, observation methods, and the mental techniques humans use to remain focused. Veilrix listened intently, absorbing knowledge that no library or simulation could provide. At one point, she caught herself staring at his hands, noticing the subtle way they adjusted to cold, the careful precision of his movements. For the first time, she acknowledged a truth she had been resisting. Humans were not weak. They were strong, resilient, clever in ways that her people rarely were. She shook her head. "It's unsettling," she admitted. "All my life I've believed in superiority, technology, genetics, training, all of it. And yet here you are showing me that raw adaptation, your species, it can surpass all of that. Maybe that's the real difference." As the night deepened, a storm began outside, howling through the ice canyons. The walls shivered under the force of the wind, snow blowing past the entrance like a living thing. Veilrix's instincts screamed for more protection, more barriers, more technology. But Ethan remained calm, checking their insulation, redistributing heat sources, and reinforcing their shelter with minimal resources. His presence reminded her that survival did not always require superior technology. Sometimes it required superior thinking. Hours later, as the storm raged, Veilrix found herself speaking aloud in a way she never had before. I am beginning to understand. Humans, you do not rely solely on tools or armor. You rely on your minds, your observation, your ingenuity. You endure where others would fail. You adapt where others would die." Her exile had been meant to isolate and punish her, yet it had brought her here, to a place where she could learn a new kind of strength. Not the strength her empire valued, not the strength she had been trained to wield, but the quiet, relentless strength of a species that refused to surrender to the odds. When the storm finally subsided, Veilrix stepped outside briefly to survey the damage. Ice and snow covered the ground in thick layers, yet nothing had shifted dangerously. She realized the storm had been another test, another reminder that survival depended not on fear but on preparation, observation, and clever adaptation. Ethan joined her, brushing snow from his clothing. "See, not so bad. Could be worse," he said with a grin, though his eyes scanned the horizon, always alert. Veilrix laughed softly, a sound almost foreign to her own ears. "Not so bad," she echoed. "You make it sound like adventure. A storm like this, it could have killed me." Veilrix realized she had learned more in one day from this human than in years of study and training in her empire. His simple adaptability, calm focus, and ingenuity were lessons she could not ignore. By nightfall, the cave was warm enough to allow sleep, though Veilrix remained partially alert, her mind racing with calculations, observations, and plans. She no longer saw the human as weak. She saw him as a model of endurance and ingenuity, a living example of how humans could thrive against impossible odds. And as she drifted into a cautious sleep, she understood something profound. Her survival no longer depended solely on her own skills. It depended on the alliance she had formed with this human, on the knowledge he shared, and on the realization that her previous beliefs about strength, technology, and survival were incomplete. For the first time since her exile, Veilrix felt a flicker of hope. Survival was possible, not because she had the best technology, not because she had been trained to obey, but because she had found a being capable of enduring, adapting, and thriving in a world that should have destroyed them both. The storm outside had passed. Inside the cave, two species, one exiled, one resilient, shared warmth, knowledge, and a fragile but growing trust. And in that trust, Veilrix realized something that would shape the rest of her exile. Humans were not weak. Humans were extraordinary, and if she could learn from them, perhaps she could survive, and perhaps even more, she could change everything she thought she knew about strength, life, and hope. The sun rose slowly over the frozen plains, its light casting long shadows across the ice. Veilrix and Ethan had survived another night, but the storm had left a stark reminder of the planet's dangers. Veilrix moved carefully outside the cave, scanning the horizon for anything unusual. Every detail mattered: the patterns in the ice, the faint trails in the snow, the way the wind shifted across the plains. Humans relied on observation, she thought, and this one, Ethan, was a master of it. Inside the cave, Ethan was already up, adjusting their makeshift heating panels. His movements were calm and methodical, but Veilrix noticed the subtle awareness in his eyes. He was always alert, always thinking several steps ahead. This human did not rely on instinct alone. He combined instinct with reason and experience. It was a combination she had underestimated until now. "I found something," Ethan said, holding up a small, partially buried device he had recovered from the wreckage. It was a fragment of an old satellite or probe, but its data storage was intact. It might contain signals, logs, something about this planet or nearby systems. As she activated the data stream, her sensors picked up fragments of information, communications, images, and logs from distant ships. Her heart sank as she recognized familiar patterns. It was from her empire. The broadcasts contained reports about her colony, the one she had refused to abandon. They described it as failed, unsustainable, and unworthy of rescue. The empire had recorded its collapse as an inevitable outcome, blaming environmental factors and human error, though humans had never been involved there. Veilrix felt a surge of anger, but also a creeping realization. Her own decisions, her refusal to leave the colony behind, had been accurate. The colony had not failed because of her mistakes, but because her empire had chosen to abandon it. Profit and control had mattered more than life. She looked at Ethan. "They lied. They said the colony was lost because it was doomed, but it was not doomed. They decided it was worthless, and that was the end of it." Sometimes leaders make choices that don't make sense morally. We adapt anyway, help each other anyway. Survival doesn't wait for permission. The more she understood, the more she realized how limited her people's view had been. As they worked together to extract more data from the device, Veilrix uncovered further details. Communications between Empire officials revealed they had labeled colonies as failures to cover up political mistakes and resource mismanagement. Any colony deemed unprofitable was left to die, regardless of the inhabitants' potential or achievements. The more Veilrix read, the more her anger grew, but it was tempered by an unexpected feeling, respect for humans who would never abandon their own, even in impossible circumstances. "This is different," Veilrix admitted. "Your species, you value life more than efficiency. You fight for survival, not for profit or status. That is something my people cannot comprehend." She had been trained to obey commands, to value logic above all else, to trust in the hierarchy of her empire. And yet here she was, learning a truth she had never considered. Survival was not about obedience or orders. Survival was about adaptation, courage, and sometimes defiance. As the day wore on, they explored further into the ice cave system. Ethan's instincts guided them safely through narrow passages, hidden traps, and slippery surfaces. Veilrix followed, her mind racing with calculations. She had designed countless survival modules and life support systems in her life, yet she realized she could learn more from this human in one day than in a decade of Empire training. At one point, they entered a large cavern with a frozen lake in its center. The air was slightly warmer here, and the sound of dripping water echoed softly. Ethan knelt, testing the ice with a small probe. "It's stable but thin near the edges. Could be useful for collecting water, though." Her sensors would have detected the ice as stable only by standard measurements, but Ethan's experience and intuition added another layer of understanding. Humans, she realized, combined reason with instinct in ways her species never did. They adapted not only physically but mentally, anticipating problems before they arose. While Ethan worked, Veilrix continued analyzing the device from the wreckage. She discovered more than just records of her empire's lies. There were faint transmissions from other systems, distress signals, unregistered colonies, messages of those abandoned by her people. The Empire's neglect was widespread, systematic. Entire worlds had been left to perish because they were deemed inconvenient or unprofitable. Veilrix felt a knot tighten in her chest. She had been exiled for refusing to abandon a colony, yet the Empire's actions were far worse than she had ever imagined. She had assumed isolation and exile were punishment enough, but the truth was that the Empire had created an entire system of suffering. Ethan noticed the change in her demeanor. "You okay?" he asked. Veilrix shook her head. "No, not okay. My people, they are worse than I thought. They call life expendable if it conflicts with their goals. They lied about the colony. They abandoned entire worlds. Doesn't matter what they think." Hours passed and night fell over the frozen landscape. Veilrix and Ethan returned to the cave, sharing their discoveries and observations. The warmth between them was no longer just physical. It was a growing understanding, a mutual respect born of survival and shared struggle. Veilrix realized she had been wrong to underestimate humans. They were not fragile, weak, or expendable. They were extraordinary, capable of enduring conditions that would have killed most of her species. Their ingenuity and courage were unmatched in many ways, and their values, the way they protected life and adapted to adversity, were lessons she could not ignore. "You know," she said quietly, "I thought I was the one teaching survival here. I thought I had all the answers. But you've taught me more in a day than I have learned in a lifetime of training." Her exile had been meant to isolate her, to punish her for defying the Empire. Instead, it had brought her to a place where she could witness something extraordinary. A human, surviving against impossible odds, teaching her not just how to endure, but how to rethink everything she had believed about strength and resilience. The night was long and cold, but inside the cave, warmth persisted. They shared rations, repaired supplies, and discussed strategies for the days ahead. Veilrix's mind raced with new ideas, how to use her knowledge of technology in combination with Ethan's adaptability, how to survive longer, how to prepare for future challenges. She realized that survival was no longer about following orders or relying solely on technology. It was about cooperation, understanding, and courage. As she drifted into a cautious sleep, Veilrix reflected on the Empire's lies, the abandoned colonies, and the harsh truths she had uncovered. And yet she felt something she had not felt in years: hope. Survival was possible, not because she was brilliant or trained, but because she had found a being capable of enduring, adapting, and thriving in ways her people had never understood. In the quiet of the cave, as the wind howled outside, Veilrix made a silent promise. She would not return to the Empire unchanged. She would survive. She would learn. And when the time came, she would expose the truth, not with weapons, not with anger, but with the resilience, courage, and ingenuity she had learned from a human. Ethan stirred beside her, adjusting the makeshift bedding, unaware of the silent vow she had made. Veilrix watched him for a moment, feeling a mix of respect and curiosity. This human, so ordinary by her species' standards, had changed her understanding of life, strength, and survival. And as the night stretched on, filled with the whispering echoes of the storm and the quiet hum of their survival devices, Veilrix realized that exile had not ended her journey. It had only begun. The human beside her, resilient, clever, and enduring, had become more than a companion. He was a teacher, a mirror, and a challenge to everything she had believed. And in the harsh, frozen world outside, she understood that survival was no longer a solitary endeavor. It was a shared struggle, a partnership that might redefine her entire understanding of life and strength. The icy wind had grown sharper, cutting across the frozen plains like invisible blades. Veilrix and Ethan had grown accustomed to survival in the harsh environment, but even the most experienced human and exiled alien could feel the pressure of a world determined to test them. Their cave provided some protection, but the stormy nights and freezing days reminded them that they were not yet safe. Each step outside, each moment in the open, demanded careful calculation. Veilrix moved to the cave entrance, scanning the horizon for any sign of change. Ice glittered under the pale light of the distant sun, and shadows stretched across jagged formations that had been carved by wind and time. She felt a mixture of awe and apprehension. This planet had no mercy, no favor, and no predictability. Every decision they made could mean survival or death. Ethan joined her, carrying small bundles of supplies they had scavenged from the wreckage. His movements were calm, deliberate, as if he were dancing with the world instead of fighting against it. Veilrix watched him carefully, realizing that this calmness was a lesson in itself. Humans, she thought, did not just endure. They adapted, they calculated, they used the environment to their advantage rather than simply resisting it. "We need to move supplies deeper into the cave," Ethan said, setting the bundles down. "Storms like last night could damage what's near the entrance. If we lose insulation, we lose warmth, and survival becomes a gamble." She had believed technology alone was enough to survive any situation. Ethan was proving her wrong. Together, they reinforced the cave's interior. Veilrix used fragments from her ship to create reflective panels that bounced the faint sunlight deeper inside, warming areas that would otherwise remain cold. Ethan adjusted airflow, redirecting warm air from small vents to critical zones. Every action had a purpose. Every decision was grounded in both knowledge and instinct. Hours passed as they worked, and Veilrix began to notice subtle patterns in the human's methods. He checked insulation with careful attention, observed how air moved within confined spaces, and used minimal energy for maximum effect. She realized that survival was not about brute strength or advanced tools. It was about efficiency, adaptation, and creativity. Humans, it seemed, had mastered this combination over millennia, evolving to thrive in conditions most species would find fatal. When the work was done, they sat together, sharing a small meal. Veilrix's mind raced with thoughts she had suppressed since her exile. The Empire's lies, the abandoned colonies, the cold calculations that had led to countless deaths. They had been trained to accept these as normal. Yet here on this frozen planet, she was learning that survival and morality could coexist. Humans, despite being technologically less advanced in some areas, had a resilience and an ethical code that her empire could not comprehend. "You know," she said quietly, "I never thought I would respect humans so quickly. I expected weakness. I expected dependence. But you thrive where I would fail. You survive where my people would perish. And you do it with morality intact. It's about using what you have, thinking ahead, and making the right choices. Sometimes the right choice is helping someone else survive, not just yourself." Survival was not just a test of strength. It was a test of wisdom, adaptability, and empathy. As the day progressed, the temperature dropped further, and another storm began to form in the distance. Veilrix's instincts screamed for immediate shelter, for reinforcing every surface, for preparing for the worst. But she also recognized a lesson she had not expected to learn so quickly. Panic was the enemy. Calm observation and clever action were the keys to survival. Ethan led her to a narrow passage within the cave system, one that she had overlooked. It was smaller, tighter, but it offered protection from the approaching storm. The passage's walls had natural formations that trapped air and reduced heat loss. Ethan carefully guided them through, using small tools to reinforce weak points. Veilrix followed, impressed at the precision and efficiency of his movements. She realized that humans did not just react. They anticipated, adapted, and optimized. Inside the passage, they set up their sleeping area and reinforced insulation. Veilrix observed the humans' methods closely, noting how every action was deliberate and purposeful. He layered materials to trap heat, positioned reflective surfaces to maximize warmth, and ensured that ventilation prevented condensation without losing critical energy. Her mind, trained for decades in technological solutions, marveled at the simplicity and effectiveness of his approach. When their preparations were complete, they sat together, listening to the storm's roar outside. Veilrix realized she was learning something profound. Strength was not just measured by power or skill, but by resilience, adaptability, and the ability to face uncertainty without fear. Humans had mastered this instinctively. "You know," she said after a long silence, "I never thought I would feel safe on this planet, yet here with you I do. Not because of technology, not because of skill, but because you understand survival differently. You respect life even in its harshest forms." Her exile had been meant to punish her, to isolate her, to remind her of her dependence on the Empire. Yet here she was, alive and learning, guided by a human who had no allegiance to her people but shared a common goal: survival. The night stretched on, and Veilrix's thoughts turned to the Empire she had left behind. She had been trained to obey orders, to trust in hierarchy and authority, to believe in the supremacy of her species. Yet all of that seemed irrelevant here. In this frozen world, survival depended on observation, ingenuity, and partnership. Her old beliefs felt fragile, inadequate, and incomplete. She realized that her exile had offered her an unexpected gift: perspective. She could see the weaknesses in her empire, the flaws in her training, and the overlooked strengths of humans. Ethan was a living example of what her species had dismissed for so long: that life, courage, and morality could coexist with resilience and survival. Hours later, exhaustion finally claimed her. She lay on the layered bedding, feeling the warmth radiating from the carefully managed heat sources. Ethan was already asleep beside her, his calm presence a silent reassurance. Veilrix closed her eyes, reflecting on everything she had learned. Humans were not weak. Humans were not fragile. Humans were extraordinary in ways her empire could never understand. And if she survived this exile, she would carry that lesson with her. She would not merely endure. She would adapt, learn, and perhaps one day teach her own people what it truly meant to be strong. The storm outside continued to howl, but inside, a fragile warmth remained. It was not just heat from tools or technology. It was warmth born from cooperation, understanding, and mutual respect. Veilrix realized that the human beside her was more than a companion. He was a teacher, a guide, and a living example of the extraordinary potential of humanity. As sleep overtook her, Veilrix made a silent promise. She would survive, not just for herself, but to honor the lessons she had learned. She would endure, adapt, and grow stronger, guided by the resilience and ingenuity she had witnessed in Ethan. And when the Empire came for her, she would be ready, not with anger or weapons, but with the understanding that true strength came from courage, adaptability, and the ability to value life in all its forms. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside the cave, two beings from different worlds shared warmth, knowledge, and a fragile trust. And in that trust, Veilrix found hope, a hope that survival was possible not just for herself, but for anyone willing to adapt, endure, and learn from the unexpected wisdom of another species. She drifted into sleep, her mind alive with possibilities. The frozen planet was harsh, unforgiving, and relentless, yet it had taught her more about life and strength than she could have imagined. She would survive, she would learn, and she would carry the lessons of this human, Ethan, with her forever. The night was long, but within the fragile shelter, warmth persisted. Veilrix understood that survival was no longer a solitary endeavor. It was a shared struggle, a partnership that transcended species, and a living proof that humans, ordinary, unassuming humans, could redefine what it meant to endure and thrive. For Veilrix, the lesson was clear. True strength was not measured in technology, hierarchy, or power. It was measured in resilience, adaptability, and the courage to survive, even in the coldest, most unforgiving corners of the universe. And with that understanding, she slept, ready to face whatever challenges the frozen world would throw at her next. The morning light stretched across the frozen plains like pale gold on a sheet of silver. Veilrix stirred first, feeling the cold creep into her bones despite the layered insulation. She glanced at Ethan, still asleep, calm and steady even in the harshest conditions. She had learned more from him than she could ever have imagined, not just about survival, but about life, morality, and strength. Today, they would face the greatest challenge yet. The storm from the night before had passed, but it had left the plains treacherous. Snowdrifts blocked familiar paths, and hidden ice patches threatened to break under weight. Beyond that, Veilrix knew the Empire's drones, always seeking her, could be scanning the planet. She and Ethan needed to move carefully, not just to survive, but to make their next steps count. Veilrix rose, checking their supplies and adjusting their gear. Her thoughts returned to the device they had recovered, the fragments of transmissions revealing the Empire's lies about abandoned colonies. She had made a decision. They would survive, not only for themselves, but to expose the truth. The Empire could no longer hide behind deception. Ethan stirred and opened his eyes, alert despite the comfort of their temporary shelter. "You're up early," he said, a small smile on his face. "I have plans," Veilrix replied. "We need to move east towards the ridge. The wind is stronger there, but it's also higher ground. We can set up a transmitter and send a message that cannot be ignored." High ground makes sense. Less snow buildup, better range, and easier to monitor potential threats. Let's go. Veilrix noticed how instinctively Ethan scanned the environment, reading subtle changes in light and wind, always predicting potential dangers. It was a skill she had thought she possessed alone, but humans had perfected it in ways her species had never taught. As they ascended the ridge, Veilrix paused. From this height she could see the vast frozen plains stretching endlessly, glittering under the pale sun. The scale of the world was humbling, and she realized the Empire had been right about one thing. Survival here was a monumental task, but they would endure. Ethan glanced at her. "We're not just surviving," he said. "We're learning. You're learning, I'm learning. That's what makes us stronger than anything else out here." Veilrix worked quickly, assembling the device with fragments from her ship and spare parts Ethan had carried. His hands moved with precise efficiency, anticipating her needs, offering small suggestions that improved her design. Together, they built a signal strong enough to reach orbit, enough to call attention without revealing their exact location. As the transmitter powered on, Veilrix monitored the signal. She could see faint replies from satellites and ships nearby. The Empire's communication systems were scrambling to trace the source, but the message was already spreading. It contained detailed evidence, logs of abandoned colonies, transmissions of distress ignored, and the calculated negligence of those in power. Ethan watched her with quiet approval. "You're sending more than a signal," he said. "You're sending a lesson, showing that survival isn't just about strength, it's about doing what's right even when it's hard." That was their true strength, and now it would be known across the Empire. As they waited for responses, the storm clouds returned, darker and heavier this time. The wind whipped across the ridge, threatening to throw them off balance. Veilrix adjusted her gear, securing the transmitter and ensuring the structure would hold. Ethan's calm presence reminded her again of the lessons she had learned. Panic and fear were useless. Adaptation, observation, and teamwork were the keys to survival. Hours passed, and faint signals reached them. Human rescue teams, unaware of the Empire's attempts to suppress the truth, were on their way. Veilrix felt a thrill of relief, but also pride. She had survived exile, faced a frozen world, and learned the extraordinary potential of humans. This knowledge would not only save her, it could reshape her understanding of life, morality, and strength forever. The storm intensified, forcing them to take shelter behind a natural ice formation. Veilrix and Ethan huddled together, sharing warmth and watching as snow whipped past like living spears. She felt an unexpected sense of gratitude toward him. This human, whom she had once dismissed, had become her partner in survival, her teacher, and her guide through the harshest challenges she had ever faced. "You know," she said quietly, "I thought I was strong. I believed in my training, my technology, my intellect. But all of that, it wasn't enough. Not for this world, not without humans." Survival was not just physical endurance or technological mastery. It was the ability to observe, to adapt, to make choices guided by intelligence and morality. Humans embodied this in ways she had once dismissed, and now she could not ignore the truth. When the storm finally subsided, they emerged from their shelter. The ridge sparkled under the sun, the frozen plains stretching endlessly. Rescue ships were visible on the horizon, approaching steadily. Veilrix adjusted the transmitter one last time, ensuring the message would reach orbit clearly. The Empire could no longer hide its failures. The truth was now in the hands of those capable of acting on it. Ethan glanced at her. "They're coming. You did it. You sent the message, and soon everyone will know what's been happening." Their values had taught her that true strength was not obedience, technology, or authority. It was adaptability, cooperation, and the courage to do what was right. As the rescue ships landed, Veilrix and Ethan were greeted by human teams trained for extreme environments. Their calm efficiency and preparedness amazed her. These humans were organized, resilient, and capable of thriving in conditions that would have crushed most species. She realized that her admiration for Ethan was not misplaced. He was part of a species whose ingenuity and endurance surpassed expectation. Veilrix addressed the teams, sharing her knowledge of the Empire's negligence and the conditions of the abandoned colonies. She provided logs, data, and observations, ensuring that the truth could not be ignored. Humans listened, documented, and prepared to act. Their response was immediate, efficient, and compassionate. Unlike her empire, they valued life above bureaucracy, morality above convenience. As the rescue operation began, Veilrix turned to Ethan. "You have shown me more than survival," she said. "You have shown me a new way to see strength, life, and responsibility. My people, they need to learn this too. But for now, I am grateful that humans exist, that you exist." Today, we both did that. Veilrix realized that her exile, intended to punish and isolate her, had instead revealed a truth far greater than survival alone. As the rescue ships lifted off, carrying them toward safety, Veilrix gazed down at the frozen plains. She thought of the empire of abandoned colonies, of failures hidden by lies. She also thought of humans, their ingenuity, their resilience, their morality. Her understanding of strength had been reshaped. Humans, she realized, were extraordinary not because they were perfect, but because they endured, adapted, and chose to protect life even in impossible circumstances. Ethan watched her quietly, knowing that the lesson was mutual. The alien woman who had once commanded him with panic and urgency had become a partner, a learner, and a witness to human strength. Together, they had faced the frozen world, survived its perils, and uncovered truths that would reverberate far beyond the icy plains. Veilrix made a silent promise to herself. She would carry this knowledge back to her people, not with arrogance or judgment, but with understanding and evidence. She would show them that true strength was not measured in authority or technology alone, but in courage, ingenuity, morality, and resilience. Humans had demonstrated this, and she would ensure the galaxy recognized it. As the ships flew toward distant horizons, Veilrix felt a sense of peace she had not known in years. Exile had tested her, the frozen world had challenged her, and a human had taught her more than she could have imagined. The lessons were clear. Survival depended on adaptability, endurance, cooperation, and the courage to do what is right. And humans embodied these traits in ways that made them extraordinary. She glanced at Ethan, grateful for his guidance, his calm presence, and his wisdom. He had not only helped her survive, but had reshaped her understanding of life and strength. For the first time since her exile, Veilrix felt hope, not just for herself, but for the possibility of a future where her people could learn from humans, where life could be valued over power, and where courage and morality could define true strength. The frozen planet disappeared beneath them, a harsh and beautiful reminder of their endurance. Veilrix closed her eyes, feeling warmth, understanding, and purpose. Survival had been achieved, but more importantly, a lesson had been learned, a lesson that would echo far beyond the icy plains. And as the stars stretched before them, Veilrix understood something she had never believed possible. Humanity was extraordinary. Not because of weapons, not because of technology, not because of rules or hierarchy, but because of resilience, adaptability, morality, and the courage to survive and protect life, even in the coldest, most unforgiving corners of the universe. And she would never forget it.